Good afternoon. It's a pleasure and a privilege to be here. I've always admired the work that WAN-IFRA does to promote print globally, and I've been part of some of their earlier efforts. I'm going to talk about the importance of print advertising in a successful advertising campaign, but I'd like to say that perhaps many of the things or some of the things that I say may not be very pleasant to the people who are actually involved in the advertising process. But this is the problem with people in advertising. We always say the wrong things. And now at the age of 60, it's difficult for me to change. So please forgive me if I ruffle a few feathers. My generation grew up on the printed word, unlike the kids sitting in the last row there. So which is probably the reason why many of us wear thick spectacles. I read my first newspaper, and it was the Hindu, when I was 7 years old. And I've continued to read it ever since. Newspaper reading, for many of us, is a habit. The challenge is, how do you make that habit interesting? And that's really what I'd like to talk about for the next 40 minutes or so. I grew up in Madras, as it used to be called in those days, and the easiest way to create chaos in a Tamilian's life was to replace his Hindu with some other paper and replace his morning cup with a cup of coffee with a cup of tea, and I'm sure his whole day would go for a 6. I mean, that's the level of attachment and involvement the newspaper gave in our lives. Today, many of us go to the mobile for the same thing, for the excitement. I read the paper at 6:30 in the morning and see my mobile at 7 o'clock in the morning. So I guess there's a significant shift in our habits as well. And the moment it becomes replacement and not an additional thing, I think the newspaper industry is going to be in a problem. I read today's report of yesterday's speaker saying that print is there for 20 years at least. I hope it's going to be there for longer. Our exposure to advertising was primarily to print, both in India and in the rest of the world. So in India, we had campaigns like this, which the younger generation might not have seen, but Air India had great advertising, even if it continues to have a lousy airline. Can't help that. Advertising is generally easier than running an airline. So this is Paris and Brussels. So a person called Bobby Kuka had created the Air India Maharaja. It continues today, though I don't know how long Air India will continue. This was one of the longest running campaigns. It's there in the I think in the Guinness Book of Records. The Amul Girl continues even today, topical stuff, primarily on hoardings, but you would still get it in the press as well. This was a campaign done for Jensen & Nicholson Paints by Rediffusion, which was one of the top flight agencies of that time. It says, whenever you see color, think of us. So all of these campaigns were brilliantly conceived, worked equally well in print and in hoardings, for example. This was primarily an outdoor campaign. In the meanwhile, lots of print advertising was happening in the West, and we were admiring it and on occasion copying it as well. We still continue to copy what's happening in other parts of the world. We have to show our reverence to people from the Western regions. A lot of Indian advertising was inspired by David Ogilvy. This was the man in the Hathaway shirt, which he talked a lot about. And this was the ad for Rolls-Royce, which says at 60 miles an hour, the loudest noise in this new Rolls-Royce comes from the electric clock. People actually read body copy in those days because it was well written. Unlike today, because today's generation, the young generation, doesn't have patience. They have an attention span of a few nanoseconds. So if you don't catch their attention in the first few seconds, then you've lost them forever. I'm sure some of you probably know this person called Bill Bernbach, who revolutionized print advertising in the world. He created the campaign for Volkswagen, which is rated by the Advertising Age as the best campaign of the last century. More Volkswagen ads talking about the colors it came in. A huge basketball player trying to get into a Volkswagen car, trying to highlight the fact that it's a small car. And this is reminiscent of what's happening today, because it says, is the economy trying to tell you something? And we all know in what great shape our Indian economy is in. This was an ad done by Saatchi, Charles Saatchi, which says, would you be more careful if it was you that got pregnant, called the Pregnant Man ad. How a single ad actually catapulted the agency to global recognition and fame. So we had more like this, Marlboro Man, created by Leo Burnett. And for those of you who are interested in smoking, the Marlboro cowboy died of cancer, as did his horse, which talks about passive smoking. This is one of the most enduring. I don't smoke, so I have a slightly holier than thou attitude than some of you on the subject of smoking. This is again a great campaign of a cowboy and how you create enduring images and properties for brands. So we've done some, or been exposed to some outstanding work in print advertising, and the sad reality is today's print advertising really sucks, if you forgive the expression. So the problem is, I read the newspaper but I don't see the ads, and that's really one of the saddest commentaries about my friends in advertising. Again, I can be fairly critical because I don't do any advertising now. I'm a consultant. Here's an ad for The Economist which says, I never read The Economist, management trainee age 42. So obviously, you know what happens to people who don't read The Economist. So I'll quickly move and talk about television advertising, because that's taken over television advertising, the imagination of the Indian viewer for the last 30 years. And I'm going to show you the first ad which really, in a sense, changed the face of television advertising in India. I was a kid, I mean not a kid, I was a young man then, and we used to go to the cinema houses and we used to be well on time to watch the commercial, because this was the first soft porn Indians were allowed to watch.
Freshness, tingling, tangier, with the exciting freshness of life. Live with fresh and soap to make a fresh new woman of you.
We even knew the name of the model. I mean, so it was really made a tremendous impact on lots of Indians. This was followed by ads like this, which signified the emergence of TV as the primary medium.
ये ज़मीं ये आसमां, हाँ, ये ज़मीं ये आसमां, हमारा कल, हमारा आज, हमारा कल, हमारा आज, बुलंद भारत की बुलंद तस्वीर, हमारा बजाज, बुलंद भारत की बुलंद तस्वीर, हमारा बजाज.
It's an interesting ad which showed the situation of the Indian economy, because you waited 7 years to get a Bajaj scooter, and all your neighbors said your horoscope was very good if you got a Bajaj scooter allotment, and then you sold it 7 years later for the same price that you bought it. So, and for many years I thought the only way to start the scooter was to tilt it to the left. The reality was the engine was to the left. But, we were used to inferior products, we didn't care a damn anyway. But more than anything else, the television ad, this was arguably one of the most successful campaigns of that time. It kept running for year after year. And in a sense, it's a very interesting ad, because this ad spelled the death knell of the agency commission system in India. I'm sure all of you are familiar with this statement that the agency business is 15% commission and 85% confusion. We don't get 15% commission now, but the confusion remains. I mean, that's one of the enduring features of the advertising business. But to go back to the Hamara Bajaj ad, Rahul Bajaj used to be the chairman of Bajaj Auto at that time, and I think this ad was done in the mid-80s. And then it was ran for 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, 7 years, 8 years, and then suddenly Rahul Bajaj called, I think Prem Mehta was the CEO of Lintas, and said, hey, listen, you've been running the same ad for 8 years, so why should I pay you 15% commission? And by which time, 91, India was also liberalized. Many of the multinational companies came into India. And so that's about the time that this 15% commission actually disintegrated. And I guess this ad was perhaps one of the reasons behind that. Brands started to use TV more and more, and print was more like an afterthought, often to signify the launch of a campaign. So, for example, if, say, 10 million rupees would be spent on a advertising, allegedly integrated advertising campaign, 7 or 8 million would go on television, and, you know, the rest would be divided amongst various other media offerings, though multiple offerings remain. This was the period when a lot of agencies actually started and believed in the power of integrated communication principle, or 360 degrees, as we used to talk of in those days. I remember Keith Reinhardt, who used to be the head of DDB Needham, an agency that we used to represent in India, speak a lot about integrated communications. And there were brands that used this. I'll show you one brand.
Bye bye, bye bye, bye bye, bye bye, goodbye. Jana hai hum. Bye bye, bye bye, bye bye, bye bye, goodbye. Jana hai hum. Go bye bye, bye bye, bye. Bye bye, bye bye, bye bye, bye bye, goodbye. Jana hai hum.
360-degree wheeling from VIP.
Bye bye, bye bye.
The thought was happy journeys, and it says bye-bye. So the press ad said bye-bye clumsy handling. So obviously they were taking the thought across medium. If you travel by Jet Airways, your baggage tag said happy journey, bye-bye. And this was about the time when the cricketer Steve Waugh retired, so they said bye-bye Steve. I was hoping they'd do an ad for Saurav Ganguly, but he refused to retire. In any case, these things happen in India. So, but slowly and surely, print was becoming less critical in the entire communication process as agencies excelled in TV advertising. India is essentially a culture of movies and entertainment, and we have probably, if you, in the television, many of you are staying at the Taj Hotel, in Yeshwanthpur, you will probably get 100 channels, probably none of them worth watching, but you will find, millions of television commercials coming across every one of those channels. And we are actually good on television, even if I say so myself. So I'll show you a quick sample of what print is facing. So that's for, you don't need print advertising if I do ads like this. This is for Vodafone. So that's what's happening to the stock market today as well. But point is, we have brilliant advertising for mobile services in India and really disastrous mobile actual service. But, our advertising agencies actually work. I mean, despite the product or service, they can actually create good advertising.
You are my pumpkin, pumpkin. Hello, honey bunny, honey bunny.
You are my pumpkin, pumpkin. Hello, honey bunny.
Hello, honey bunny, honey bunny. Reading something, something.
Hello, honey bunny.
Honey bunny.
Honey bunny.
Hello, honey bunny.
I am your dumpling, dumpling.
Feeling something, something.
Money, money, noy. Honey bunny.
Hello, honey
Bunny.
Hello, honey bunny.
Toko, toko. Toko, 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 toko. क्या गाना है? कहाँ सुना?
You're my pumpkin, pumpkin. Hello, honey bunny. I'm your...
Hello?
You my pumpkin, pumpkin. You my pumpkin, pumpkin. Hello, honey bunny.
आइडिया है तो फोन विल रिंग.
You're my pumpkin, pumpkin.
कश्मीर से कन्याकुमारी तक फोन विल रिंग.
Dumpling, dumpling. Hello, honey bunny. Feeling something, something. Hello, honey bunny, honey bunny. Togo, togo.
What a network.
Tring, 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 tring. Hello, honey bunny.
What a lie. Anyway.
पुलिस को फोन लगा यार. लगा.
मिस कॉल दिया है, करेंगे वापस.
अब बिंदास कॉल कर रात भर एयरटेल पर.
हर फ्रेंड जरूरी है यार.
So the point I'm making is none of these campaigns actually need print advertising for support. So they're all being driven by television, and that's, I think, is one of the biggest challenges that we have to face. And the agencies seem to be losing the interest or the ability to create for the printed medium as print became an afterthought. And sadly, the reality is the top flight agencies in India are led by people who have made their reputation making television commercials, whether it's Balki of Low Lintas, who's my friend, or Piyush Pandey, or, you know, all the big reputations, the creative guys who lead these agencies are actually guys who make brilliant films. So the sad reality is that print has suffered because the entire focus has been on television. You get your visibility on television. People are watching television all the time. So to break through the clutter is actually becoming the biggest challenge, and that is something that the advertising industry and newspapers, because your revenue is coming from there, has to crack in some big way. In a sense, a lot of print advertising seems to cue the statement made 50 years ago. 50% of my advertising is wasted. Trouble is, I don't know which 50%. Because, you know, I see a lot of ads, but I mean, none of them seem to make any impact on me. And if you look at the large categories, real estate, for example, in Bangalore, is a large category, and they do all these full-page ads, which I wonder who reads. So these are some of the ads which come. And then I have a major problem with these ads because there's a toll-free number which is given here. And when do you get the newspaper? You get it at 6:30 in the morning. There are bold people like me who can't sleep. We're waiting for the newspaper vendor to come at 6:30. And at 6:30 in the morning, I'm calling this number. And nobody is going to answer till 9:30 or 10. So why do you have a number? The point is, the paper is read at 6:30 or 7 in the morning. So you better have somebody manning, and you spend lakhs of rupees. And at that point of time, I want to get some information. And maybe it would be Sunday. I would probably see it in the morning. But if you're going to respond 4 hours after I made the call, they will always call back. There will be nobody who will take the call when you're at it hot. So I feel a lot of the advertising is not really being response driven, or you're not even able to measure what's happening in terms of your advertising. And that's the challenge. You still believe that an ad in Times of India or Deccan Herald is working, so I'm releasing the ad. But what are you doing to monitor response? And for example, in a website, I know how many people have logged in today. Why can't I follow some of these principles in print? This is not to say that all print advertising does not work. Exceptions will always prove the rule. And so here's innovations continue to happen. Here's a very successful ad done for Brew, where you could actually smell the coffee along with the newspaper. So this was something which I couldn't forget, or people remembered, because you were queuing in what the brand property of coffee aroma was. The Times of India seems to be spending a lot of money. I don't know if they're selling as many cars. But here there was a talking ad which frightened a lot of people in the morning, because suddenly the newspaper started talking. I'm sure they spent a lot of money on the ad. But again, you know, innovations like this cost money, and maybe the small to medium advertiser may or may not be able to do it. But I still think there's a lot of scope for doing stuff innovatively. I remember media used to be called the other creative department. And I know many of these innovations are being driven by the media agencies or the media buying agencies. And I always believe, why can't innovation flow from the publication? The publication makes something possible after the creative agency or the media agency pushes it to say, are you going to do this now? If you don't do this, I will go to some other newspaper. So I feel if the newspapers, because they are the ones I think, who are slightly threatened today, they have to come back to the agency and say, let's do this. Like, for example, we have the local pages. Why can't I do only local ads in that space? I'm sure some stuff is happening, but I'm not really studied the industry to the extent that I should for me to comment. But I still believe as a reader, here I'm speaking as a consumer, I still believe that there isn't too much happening around the newspaper and its advertising to interest me as a consumer. Like, for example, all of us know about direct response advertising because we can actually measure what's happening. I'll show you some old ads. So this ads done in the UK, US, for example. Last year, Jim Courier gave his parents a car and a condo in Hawaii. Have you considered tennis for your son? And there's a number at the end of it. Or there's another ad which says, Monica's hurt, Jennifer's in rehab, Steffi's slumping, quick sign your daughter up for tennis lessons. So when I ran these two ads, I would know which ad pulled more. So one was called the son ad and one was called the daughter ad, and I know which ad pulled more. So it was possible for me to measure what's happening. I'm not sure if that same level of response measuring is happening in a lot of print advertising that is being released in the country. I'm here, and please, I'd like to hasten to add that I'm only talking about what's happening in India. I'm not familiar with what's happening in the rest of the world, and possibly some things are happening, but I think this is really where advertising agencies have to go to make print advertising successful, to go and tell the client, hey, this is working, and this is the sort of response that I'm getting for your advertising in this particular newspaper. Or this is for an international bartending institute. It says work where the motto is eat, drink, and be merry. Or it says work behind a big desk with a killer stereo, widescreen TV, and a wet bar. And this one says we put more people behind bars than the FBI. But I still have numbers, and that's really what I'm talking about a response device, which advertising industry or advertising agency would do. We still have a website, but I don't know what's the level of, monitoring to check how effective the ads are, or how to make them more effective. Or, for example, this ad for the Economist is not an ad, it's a mailer. It says, Mr. R. Sridhar forms opinions and voices them, gives advice and takes it, answers questions and questions answers, makes decisions and follows them. None of it is true, but, because the Economist says it's true, I subscribe to them. So, again, a question of direct response advertising which makes me to respond in a particular way. So I'm saying perhaps the time is right for print advertising, and whether it comes from the advertising agency or the newspaper, I'm not really clear, but it's the time to perhaps reinvent, introspect, and look where we are and what we can do better. Or this is for the Jet Airways. I remember I'm a frequent flyer. I didn't go on Jet Airways for some time, so they sent me a mailer which says, now we see you, now we don't, it's been a while since we saw you on board. So they're actually tracking my flying or non-flying and saying, you matter to me as a customer, why didn't you do that? So again, we talk about consumers. The newspaper industry I've been a reader of the Hindu for 53 years. So really speaking, if you really talk about lifetime value, lifetime value of me as a customer is very high. But what does the Hindu know about me other than the fact that I buy the newspaper? Whereas if I had been a customer of another organization for 53 years, I'm sure they know even where I eat or what time I brush my teeth. I mean, that's the level of information and data mining that companies are doing. So maybe there's a time for the newspaper industry to look at the rich data of customers that it has and see what it can do with it. Can print advertising learn from online media? I'm sure some of you in the UK especially are familiar with the campaign for Dove, which showed all these young anorexic women using Dove, and then a lot of old and fat people said, we use Dove too, and they posted all these pictures on YouTube, and so they had no option but to start showing real life models and using it in their campaign. So again, I think there's an opportunity for newspapers to engage with their readers. Right now, there's not enough engagement which is happening with me as a reader. There is information, there is, they showed me all those, the last video which the previous speaker showed was very interesting of how people were immersed in the newspaper. I agree, they're immersed in the newspaper, but they're not immersed in the ads. So we have to find a way of making people immersed in the ads, because the revenue still, unfortunately, comes from the advertising. If the lady was reading the ads, I'm sure she would have seen the guy take his pants off. But she wasn't. She was reading the editorial, I guess. So newspaper reading is a habit. How do you make it interesting? If it's a habit, it's like going to the toilet in the morning. I take the newspaper with me. Now I even take my mobile phone. I don't even read the newspaper in the toilet. And I guess people are changing all the time. How do you make this an interesting part of my life is really the challenge. And advertising has a role to play in that as well. And I think that's really where Indian advertising, I'm repeating, Indian advertising is failing. It's not, I don't know really much about global advertising. And this is a challenge for both the advertising agency and the media to work out in the future, because our fortunes are linked to the reader being hooked onto the paper, not only for the news, but for the advertising. And this is a big problem in India, because the success, my getting the newspaper is really a function of that last mile, a poor boy who can't even read English. So every day he comes and asks me, 5 papers in Kannada. And I say 5 papers. I have to pick the 5 papers which he has to throw in my paper. Every week, the newspaper vendor changes. The newspaper boy who delivers the paper changes. And you know, whilst the newspapers are investing so much in technology and so much in getting it printed, why can't they fix the last mile? They really have to fix the last mile. Because this is the point of delivery. We talk about point of purchase and point of sale. To me, the point of purchase is that guy who's delivering the newspaper to me in the morning, and if he's late, I shout to him and shout at him, and suddenly at 8:30 he will bring the paper which he was supposed to deliver at 6:30, saying the paper didn't come. So there are a lot of issues there which leaves the reader very unhappy. So maybe there's something that, and it's not a new problem. Ever since I was 7 years old, I've been waiting for the newspaper vendor, and it's not a new habit. And many people in Chennai, for example, if the paper comes at 6:15, get very upset. I know that, because the sun comes very early in that part of the world and it's so hot that you better get up. So this is a very interesting quote by Gary Hamel, the management guru, who says, if a company is interested in finding the future, most of what it needs to learn, it must learn outside of its own industry. I think the newspaper industry would do well to look at other industries. It's perhaps looking at advertising, it's perhaps looking at online, it's perhaps looking at, printing, all of which are related. But I think the answers to some of the solutions of the newspaper industry might lie outside, say in mobile services. It may, like we talked about, if you look at India, one of the biggest successes is a company called Flipkart. And where people are buying books online, buying music online, buying clothes online. And if they are able to fix the online delivery of so many complex things to different parts of the world, I'm sure you can fix the delivery of the newspaper to my house, which is right in the middle of town. So I think the answers to the future for the newspaper industry might well lie outside of the industry, and perhaps the industry has been too inward looking, and here again I speak without really understanding many of the developments that the industry may have been going through. But I speak as a well-wisher who really is fascinated by the newspaper, and which has given me so many memorable and enjoyable moments in the last 50 years of my life. So I speak more as a friend, even if I may sound like a critic at this point in time. So print advertising is at an important juncture in its own life. It needs to reinvent itself, and now is really the time to do it, and that's my humble view. And this is perhaps something that many of you may have seen, but it's perhaps relevant to the print advertising industry. It says every morning in Africa, a gazelle wakes up. It knows that it must run faster than the fastest lion, or it will be killed. Every morning a lion wakes up. It knows it must outrun the slowest gazelle, or it will starve to death. It doesn't matter whether you're a lion or a gazelle. When the sun comes up, you'd better be running. I think I'd better be running because I haven't exceeded my time. Thank you very much for a patient listening. It's been a pleasure talking to you. And if I have offended some of you, I'm sorry. I'm like that only. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sridhar. It was a fascinating presentation. Any questions for the speaker?
If there are no questions, it means that everybody has understood everything or not understood anything, either of which is okay by me.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, please.
See, the one thing you haven't mentioned, how much money these agencies make, creative agencies make on making a TVC vis-a-vis a printed. then money also matters. So their energy goes that way, not in print.
I agree. So there is a challenge there, and I think that's something. I think there are two issues. One is the money. Absolutely. When I make a film, I know many of these commercials that I showed you will probably cost 1 crore or 1.5 crores to make. Sometimes they, we don't have good roads in India, in case, so if I have to make a motorcycle commercial, I have to go to South Africa or New Zealand, because that's really where the roads are. At least that's what the creative agency will tell you. And they probably make a markup of 20-25 lakhs on a television commercial. So you're probably right. That's a challenge. And also I feel, we talk about creative reputations. We have some 3 young journalist aspirants here. I think it's a lot more exciting for journalist aspirants to go into television journalism, because you can make a creative reputation in 1 year, 2 years. Similarly, I can make a reputation as a copywriter if I make 1 television commercial. And that is more difficult to do in print. You're right. I think so. There are many issues that need to be addressed, and the point that you made is very relevant.
Yeah. Any more? I just have a point to add.
Sure.
Yesterday we had a speaker from Sri Lanka. He also mentioned that a lot of innovations are driven by, publishers themselves, then from the agency. So, just to say,
yeah,
good. Thank you.
Here.
Yeah, you said that. Any suggestions?
See, I think 2-3 things need to happen. I think the advertising industry, and I've been actively involved in training a lot of people in the industry, is that the entire focus is on, I think it's a problem with the current generation. It's like a get-rich-quick sort